We're going to move into our foundation session. So our keynote speaker is Hetxw'ms, Brett Huson, who is a multi-award-winning author and proud member of the Gyetxw Nation. He's also a researcher at the Prairie Climate Center at the University of Winnipeg. Brett's work focuses on weaving Indigenous and Western scientific approaches in the fight against climate change. He's dedicated to changing the narrative and promoting dialogue around Indigenous pedagogies and epistemologies. And his talk will be about weaving Indigenous knowledges to enhance climate resilience. Please welcome Hetxw'ms.
Oh, there we go. Nide, Amasilchsa, Hetxw'ms Gyetxw e lachsen zich wilkal huchswi, wilpgut genoeg wilsawitwi. My name is Hetxw'ms Gyetxw. I come from Gyetxw territory in the northwest interior of what the settlers now call British Columbia. I'm from Gyetxw Lachip, a territory called Hetxw'ms, which means the Caribou Ravine. For the remnant of the time when the glacial maxima was down low, the territory was named for the caribou who traveled through that region. Nachnichsin, or nachni, is the art of listening, or the ability to listen. This is a key part of Gyetxw pedagogy. And often we talk about Indigenous knowledges as traditional. One of the reasons it's been referred to as traditional is to put an endpoint on our way of knowing. The words we use in English have caused a semantic change in our cultures, making cultural, language, and law revitalization challenging. This has diminishing effects on how the rest of the world interacts with Indigenous knowledge systems. From the Gyetxw perspective, whose name means people of the river mists, we were entrusted with language, reasoning, and the ability to remember and learn. These gifts were not for our personal use, but to maintain the health of the lands for all who inhabit the physical realm. This principle guides how we adapt ourselves to the needs of the land, rather than altering it to suit our desires. This responsibility was gradually inherent to the people. Like many others, the Gyetxw had to learn about the world they were born into. Who better to learn from than the beings that have already been calling this home long before the Gyetxw were ever a thought? Gyetxw stories tell of learning from Raven, immortalized in the tales of Gyet, the shape-shifting wanderer, whose mischievous nature led to the creation of much of the Gyetxw world. Or the stories of the blue jay that showed us the lessons about fire. These stories express the nature of how some blackbirds create more food opportunities by taking fire from wildland fires or lightning strikes and spreading it. They would do this to create more food opportunities than to get the animals that were fleeing the fire and some who would die from exposure. It was an easy meal. So in each of these stories, Gyetxw created woven life lessons, teachings about Gyetxw law, many observations of the natural world. When we learn, we call this sibulaksa. Similarly, the stories that build the cultures of many other Indigenous peoples were never simple mythologies or lore. The unique epistemologies expressed in the stories, shared from generation to generation for thousands of years, each carries a framework for being stewards of the lands that they are from. Like the people of the Great Plains who used to do controlled burns across the grasslands to create new growth so that the bison would find their favorite grasses to eat. In doing this, the bison became natural tillers of the land, turning hard, compacted soils into lush ecosystems teeming with life. This strategy of moving annual controlled burns to different regions was more than just ensuring a steady supply of food. It was a sophisticated ecological intervention aimed at enhancing the biodiversity of the land. In the Pacific Northwest, nations modified spawning habitats of ulican, clams, and salmon to improve the economic opportunities and biodiversity of the surrounding lands. This economic development focused on nurturing the symbiotic interplay between human communities and their natural environment. This perspective is very different than the industrialized Western practice, which prioritizes human needs at the expense of ecological integrity. The Gyetxw believed that Gyetxw, the spider, connected all the world. This was because through observation, we used to see mycelium woven into the soil, roots of plants, and under the moss. We believed it connected the world because we would see the land flourish as the salmon lay decomposing on the earth. And we see that it was connected into everything. This interconnectedness, this shared responsibility for the health of our planet is not just a belief, but a powerful reminder of our collective role in environmental sustainability. It is a call to action for all of us to work together for a better future, fostering a sense of unity and collective purpose. Next slide's not working. Right. I'm inspired by the work of my colleague, Hetxw'ms, a professor at the University of Manitoba, whose research is on the cutting edge of understanding plant microbiomes and how fungi can be mitigators. Their work is crucial to the exploring nature-based solutions in climate change. And Jana Whale, a fellow Gyetxw researcher at the beginning of her career, is already making big moves in weaving Indigenous and Western perspectives for better resiliency and adaptation. Her research is important in bridging the gap between Indigenous and Western science, offering new insights into sustainable practices. Well, there we go. My work in Indigenous Knowledges is kind of an unconventional path. I had aspirations and dreams of working in geomorphology, but I encountered a racist prof who was failing me because I told her that what she was teaching about Indigenous civilizations was inaccurate. I then met a filmmaker named Monty Bissett, who did a documentary about Dall sheep and also one of my nation's people. And this pushed me into the direction of film. After a long time trying to navigate this industry, I didn't see a path to get to what I wanted to accomplish. I was then invited to write an article for a youth magazine called Red Rising magazine. My publishers saw the article and asked if I wanted to turn it into a book. And this provided the beginning for my long-term plan. I am now providing different perspective to young people all across the country about the interconnectedness of the world around them. A good friend of mine then connected me with Dr. Ian Morrow. He's now with Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions at UVic. He's director there. But Ian and the Prairie Climate Center, they developed the Climate Atlas of Canada. And they were now seeking to create an Indigenous Knowledges section at the request and guidance of Indigenous leadership, knowledge carriers, youth, and scholars, with the support and vision of Elder Dave Kershane, the late Elder Dave Kershane. The path that PCC traveled and the relationships they fostered through ceremony and respect were great examples of what collaborative weaving of knowledge systems can look like. Participatory video research, recognition of data sovereignty, and obligations to meaningfully engage in reciprocity are crucial for working with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. So what can we do? The urgency of the climate crisis demands immediate action. So change how communities interact with their ecosystems. This means we change how people interact with the land. I know a lot of municipalities have municipal borders, but ecosystems don't care about your borders. The watersheds are still impacted by everything that municipalities decide to do. and everything that industrial projects decide to do. There is no such thing as project borders or municipal borders or provincial borders. That's a figment of our own imagination. We need to advocate for change, look to leadership, start a different dialogue, and try to create different discussion points. We need to reduce our emissions on an individual level, but more importantly, on an industrial level. As we continue this path forward, I want us to collectively think about our position on this planet. The Gyetxw believe that we belong to the land. We are a part of the world just as much as any other being. But unlike other beings, we live in a narrow margin of ecological homeostasis. We are the most dependent on all the things that exist. We're the most dependent of all the things that exist on the planet, on which we are the most harmful. The health and well-being of Indigenous people are a direct reflection of the health and well-being of the land. We are resilient. We can teach the world how to survive the worst. And I am here, as many my other colleagues are, seeking meaningful relationships to provide an important and sustainable path forward. So thank you for lending me your ears today and your emotions. I should recognize that. Emotions are a big play in a lot of my talks, because for a lot of people, they get defensive, especially men. They get hurt. They don't want to talk about it. Some emotional intelligence is something that we kind of lost along the way. So I want to recognize the emotion that people feel as well for new information, for new ways of thinking. And I just want to thank all of you for giving me an opportunity to share with all of you, and hope that I offered a little bit of insight in something that will help you think of your work a little bit differently moving forward. So thank you very much. And I think we're going to do a little bit of questions. I wanted to push it along a little further so we have more time for questions. I usually get a lot of questions.
Okay, so we do have time for questions. So you can come up to the mics and ask questions, or we're going to show you how to use the Mentimeter to ask questions. So if you don't mind, Brett, just hanging out for a second, we're going to put up the Mentimeter slide. So think of your questions for Brett. You can go to the mics. And the reason we're using the Mentimeter is because it helps people online and in the room ask questions and have equal opportunity.
And don't feel shy. Often I get a lot of people who come up to me after because they're too shy to ask in front of others. But by all means, please feel free to ask any question. I don't get offended because I've heard a lot worse, trust me. Yeah.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much. That was really beautiful. My name's Jen. I'm here with the Métis Nation of Alberta. My question is, you came from a film background and that kind of, you have that as well. I'm wondering your thoughts on what role or where art and bringing art into the climate space, what role that has and the importance potentially of that in pulling art and storytelling into when we talk about climate change.
Yeah, one of the things that I really find interesting in our culture, art wasn't art. There was no such thing as artistic practice. It was just a way of life. We created beautiful things, beautiful carvings, but they were ways of recording our knowledge systems. So, like just as an example of something that's more popular term, people say totem pole. Totem is a word in Anishinaabe that means clan. It had nothing to do with the people on the West Coast, but that was all the people that were coming over there knew because they would hear that word from other places. But the poles, I cannot stand this term, I'm at the top of the totem pole. People don't know what that means. They would see chiefs images at the top of poles, but the reason that is because it's the least important part of the pole. The most important was the connection to the earth and all of the people that hold that person up. Had nothing to do with the person at the top. That's the colonial mindset of how they think about the way that being at the top works. And so with art, it was a way of life. And that's one of the things that I do with my work. Art is a way for me to communicate the research and information that I do. The Prairie Climate Center uses that and utilizes that in all of the work that they do. The participatory video research, the documentary films that we have on the Climate Atlas are proof of how we use art for research. So it's very significant and important part because hard data research is important, but how are we going to communicate that information to the rest of the world and the people who are making the decisions based on that research? You want to get across certain ideas from that research. A good way to do that is through art.
Thank you. Excellent. And we'll take a question from the Mentimeter and then we'll go to the mic. Okay, so there was a question up there that said, what's the best way to approach a member of a First Nation if you want to explore working together?
It's different from community to community. I think one of the best ways, if you don't know someone from the community already who is working in academia or in some sort of position of research, then it's to connect to the some communities it would be a band office, other communities it would be government office, but connecting to them and just kind of letting them know that you wanted to begin a relationship. But really it's being open from the beginning, not expecting that you're going to have one meeting and call it consultation. The reason that a lot of communities want to build those deeper relationships is because it's important. The information that we share is really important, and we want to make sure that the information does not just get absorbed into something integrated, that it's actually just woven and still there and is still recognized as information that comes from the community.
Hi, my name is Erin Robbins. I'm from Manitoba EMO. So I was wondering, we have flood events, many of them kind of in Manitoba, and we're looking at ways to bring sort of Indigenous knowledge into flood forecasting. But there's often a barrier that's sort of there in terms of it's not considered science. So I'm just wondering, how would we sort of break the barrier down so that somebody that's sort of relying more on hard scientific facts for flood forecasting, for example, if how could we sort of break that barrier so that they would just consider some of those Indigenous knowledges when it comes to like forecasting for different natural disasters and that type of thing? I know that's a very specific question, but there's sort of a lot of hesitancy to bring that kind of knowledge into this field. And I'm just curious as to like, how would we sort of go about doing that?
Well, I think really it's about looking at translating that knowledge, but also it's just getting rid of the hierarchical, patriarchal structure in research. You're not going, if your research is sound, you're not going to harm it by adding information as long as you know that there's consistent information. So if you have observation just from one person, that's different. But if you go to community and they constantly agree on certain things, that's a whole nother different way of understanding. So I'll give you an example. My great-grandfather spent a lot of time with a biologist in the early 1900s trying to tell them that the salmon were a keystone species and that the rainforests, temperate rainforests of British Columbia were created because of that species and that it's balanced because of that species. And he would tell them that they fed the land and they wouldn't listen to him. And then my grandfather was doing the same, spent time with a biologist, and they were just counting salmon, looking at spawning grounds, and all this information they were feeding them. It wasn't until the late 90s that the research finally started coming out. They're like, oh, hey, guess what? The salmon are feeding the ecosystem. And they didn't credit any of the people with it. But that information, we've been telling them since the early 1900s. Yes, we didn't know it wasn't marine-derived N15. Of course, we didn't know that. But we still observed the process. We knew it. 100% we knew it. And we used different terminology. Yes, we talked about the spider connecting the world. But if they just listened and said, oh, look what they were talking about, it's mycelium, they would have found this stuff out far earlier because there's observation. It's that language barrier that's a component of that, but it's also ego, kind of trying to be the higher intelligence and power. That's the patriarchy of the system. So really trying to get as much information as you can is not going to harm, because you still have the commonality above all of it, the observed commonality above all of that data. So it's just a matter of giving that respect and actually going in and listening. That's why I started off with saying the art of listening. You have to listen.
Okay, there we go. We know we're not going to get to everyone's questions, and we just recognize that. And that's why we're using this tool so that we can endeavor to answer your questions afterwards. But we do have time for, I'd say, 2 more. So if you want to ask a quick question, and then I'm thinking we'll address the storytelling question, and then we'll go on to the next one. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Brett. My name is Andre Efrig. You were involved recently with a federal publication for Our Future, Indigenous Resilience. And I'm curious if you could talk a bit about why you think that's an important document for all of us to read, and how those of us who are settlers might use it. Thanks.
I think one of the things that first just to recognize is that, I'm not the first person doing this. There have been many Indigenous scholars before me and who've been trying to push this type of work forward. But it wasn't until recently, and especially because of social media, people are starting to learn what Indigenous knowledges actually are. They're learning about what Indigenous communities can offer to society. So there's a greater perspective now, and that perspective is starting to force government to look at things in different ways. And so the opportunity for my fellow scholars who wrote the publication to put the research out, it's a very powerful opportunity, and the ability to share adaptation potential, the research around what Indigenous knowledges are and how they can push forward the field of adaptation and mitigation. Those are things that are going to be key out of that report. And that's just the beginning. The authors had a lot more to contribute. They wanted me to be a part of the project, but by the time they knew who I was, they had already started writing. So I became more involved in the design element of it. So I created the design work and helped put together that part of the report. But it's really key to know that there are many of us out there doing this type of work. And now that we're getting more opportunities to actually publish more often, because there have been Indigenous scholars who have published in the past, just that it's being recognized more as a very sound form of information, a sound way to actually build and develop frameworks for adaptation in and around those types of knowledges. Plus, it's adding, when you get support like that from a report that is from the Western government, it's not my government. I'm Gyetxw. My government is at home. I'm Gyetxw, and that's it. I'm forced to carry a Canadian identification, but I am Gyetxw. So that government is now adding a little bit of validity to other nations to be able to contribute more of their knowledge. So the report is vital in that respect.
Hello. And just a note on the report for Our Futures, there is a webinar on that next week. May 15th, and Meredith Caspel from Natural Resources Canada is here. There she is waving at the back. So approach her if you want any information on the webinar on the For Our Futures report. So thank you, great question. And the last one we'll take before we move on is about storytelling. And so we talk a lot about storytelling and promote it as a way of having better communication around connecting with people and around explaining climate changes. And this question is about how do the stories change as the climate changes? And have you observed that change in the way that stories are being told, or have you heard interesting stories about climate change?
Yeah, so I'm in the process of writing new stories, stories that talk about the present time that we're in. But I also wrote an article in the January-February issue of Canadian Geographic about the white bear. You can still find it online. It's no longer on stands, but you can get it online. You can order copies if you want. But in there specifically, I talk about the stories about the white bear. What Westerners, I think they call it the Kermode bear, named after some dude. But we call it the white bear because it's a white bear. And it's a bear that's not an albino. In our stories, this bear was connected to the last glacial maxima and the maxima before that. And we talk about how we started to see these bears when the ice was at its maximum. We were pushed to the edge of the coastline. All of the species of bear were put together and their food sources changed. So more often, you were finding black bears eating more and more salmon, which they did in spawning season. But when they started to increase how much salmon they were eating, they had to adapt. Grizzlies already adapted to this by getting the grizzled fur. They're brown bears that have grizzled, blondish fur. It makes it harder to see them on waterfalls and white water, so the fish don't see them as often. So the black bears adapted to that, and that's kind of like the prevailing theory in Western science, but it's also something that we observed through our storytelling about the past. So storytelling carries a lot of key information. Again, it's about this translation component. The stories were always pushed to mythologies and lore. That's what Western schools teach you. Public schools teach you that all of this is mythology. But there's truth behind all of it. And storytelling, the reason we would tell stories in a very fantastical way is you remember beauty, you remember very spiritual elements of incidences, of information, more than you do just saying a simple fact. One more quick example is about Tsibasa, the one-horned mountain goat. And this was during the time of Demlahamed, our city. The last time our city stood was at the receding of the last glacial maximum. Demlahamed was a city of about 450,000 people. And at that time, they had overused the resources of the territory, overlogged the side of the mountain. And during a process that created the landslide, it devastated that city. So the nation split up into their different areas. But in the story is taught through Tsibasa, the one-horned mountain goat, and how people were mistreating the mountain goats. And Tsibasa was angry, so he flicked pieces of the mountain onto the people to teach them how not to mistreat the mountain goat. So storytelling is important because that became, Tsibasa is now a chief's name. So that chief has the responsibility of carrying the story forward. And they carry that story forward through songs, through dance, through art. But there are also people, along with the storytellers, who disseminated the facts behind the stories. And that's something that was lost during processes of colonization. Another one that I can think of, and I don't know too well, I could be misspeaking, but I think of, what was it, Hiawatha, I think, in the Six Nations. People often looked at Hiawatha as this person who talked and brought all the leaders together, but Hiawatha was the speaker, the thinker who created that idea with other people behind them. But again, that comes from that Western approach. They like to recognize one man and not recognize the nation or the people who the teachings come from. But they had jobs. People like that had jobs. So in my nation, the same as we have storytellers, And then we have people who know the stories and they can disseminate the truths out of those stories. But the stories are important to tell because along with those stories, you're giving laws that govern how we interact with the land, laws that tell you how you shouldn't behave with the land. That's how we protect the land. So the stories were elements that carried everything forward. And that's why I say it's a framework. Because they don't just tell you a mythological story, they tell you the laws, they tell you the teachings, they tell you the facts. But you need to be able to translate it. Thank you, everybody.